Hi there. Thanks ever so much for agreeing to spend some time with us this afternoon to give us it's actually our fifth expert panel. Um, and this panel is for change creation and people make it work clients primarily. So change creation is a cohort-based leadership program that runs over 2 years with 40 organisations and 60 leaders. The programme started in November 2019. And People Make It Work has been running for 20 years now, helping cultural organisations to change and develop. We've got 50 consultants who work as part of our team across the country and across a range of cultural specialisms. And some of those people are with us today. So I'm going to ask each of our 4 other panelists to kind of introduce themselves and give us a kind of 1-minute snapshot of what they're going to cover later on in the panel. And then we'll spend a short amount of time with each person in turn after that. So first of all, Ellen, could I ask you to give us a bit of an introduction and then tell us what kinds of things you're thinking you might talk about a bit later on in the panel.
Sure, thank you, Richard, and thank you for inviting me to be here. It's really great. So I'm Ellen, I'm a freelance business coach and consultant, and I work with People Make It Work. I'm also an associate with Nesta and Creative United. So much of my work with arts organisations is around enterprise and innovation and looking at new ways of doing things, new products and new forms of leadership. So I think what I wanted to share today were a few of my reflections from the last week or so that have been personal reflections, but also come through conversations that I've been having with clients and with some of the projects I'm working on. The first one is kind of noticing a move in the tone and the conversation through stability, although we're still talking about that, into starting to think about what next and how do we plan for that and how do we start to make decisions around that. And that's prompted conversations around a need for a more emergent approach to planning and what does that mean and are we geared up for that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and approaches to that. The second thing was I feel like this crisis has really shone a spotlight on things for us. A friend of mine who's far more spiritual than me has described it as the big reveal, which really resonated with me in some ways. And I think it's really shone a light on fragility of things, but also the essential nature of other things. So from an organisational perspective, I've been thinking about what that looks like in terms of what are we seeing differently, what are we understanding differently, and how does that help us deliver on our purpose by deploying what we have in a different way. And the third thing, which sits alongside that, but it's very different, and it's around loss and grief and acknowledging the fact that we're all experiencing that on some level, whether that's very personal, loss of connection or loss of work or loss of loved ones even, as well as on a collective level. And so I've been thinking about what that means on an organisational level and how we can kind of hold the space for acknowledging loss on one side and doing some futures thinking on the other.
Right, thank you very much, Ellen. Looking forward to hearing more about those ideas. Michele, would you like to do the same and introduce yourself and then tell us a bit about some of the ideas that you plan to unpack a bit later in this panel?
Sure, thanks Richard, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm Michele Taylor, and I'm Director for Change for Ramps on the Moon, which is a consortium of theatres working to normalise the visibility and presence of disabled and deaf people across the mainstream theatre industry. I'm a freelancer, and I'm a consultant and trainer in disability issues primarily. I'm also a coach. And so my reflections today come out of my own personal experience of the last 3 or 4 weeks and how that's been for me personally and what's been important to me and the emerging themes. And they resonate with the themes that have emerged from conversations that I've been having from with other people working in large organisations, which is not my experience. But what's emerged for me is an ABC plus D and E of themes that start with what always seems to be a starting point for me, which is awareness, noticing as really, really crucial. So that's the first thing, and then circles all the way around through B, C and D to get to the E, which is experience, which for me is the nub of what's really exercising me at the moment around how do we take what we're all going through now, what we're each going through now, and turn that into learning for tomorrow and next month and next year. So those are the things I'm going to be talking about.
Great, thanks so much, Michele. That sounds absolutely fascinating. I can't wait. Alex, would you like to do the same?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me. My name's Alex Rinsler. I'm an artist and freelance cultural producer, most recently the artistic director for Love Light Norwich, a new light and ideas festival in Norwich, supported by Arts Council England. As of 2 months ago tomorrow, I am a father for the very first time, and trying to wrap my head around that, as well as wrapping my head around the magnitude of change that we are all experiencing. I want to share a few personal reflections on that, and end up with a tool that I hope can be helpful, that I found very helpful, but also can be helpful perhaps for either your colleagues or your staff members who may be on the artistic side and feeling adrift, that their career bringing people together is no longer possible. So I look forward to that.
Thanks very much, Alex. Brilliant. And finally, Anna.
Hello, so I'm coming to you from Worcestershire, the West Midlands. I have been freelancing for the last couple of years, working with a whole variety of art forms and across England and Wales, and often around strategy and business planning and how to try and find new forms of income, that kind of stuff, with a particular interest in change and change management. So that's bringing all of that learning and experience bubbling right up to the surface. And one of the things I just wanted to say before was just a big thank you. I think one of the things that's been amazing has been about having one's joy of working in the sector kind of reaffirmed by the response that we've seen. I think the adaptability has just been awesome. The way that teams have repurposed what they've got and what their skills are, and the speed with which people have got new offers out there, and playing a role in really different ways in the community has been amazing. And it's just made me think, I'm so glad to work, however difficult it is, and however we're in for the long haul. It has made me fundamentally very, very glad to work in the sector. So I suppose the things that are on my mind at the moment are around this sense of divergence that's sort of opening up its intention with this wonderful feeling of like solidarity, and that we're all experiencing some common stuff together, but noticing both between organisations and within organisations these differences opening up depending on, like, if you're an organisation, what your financial and operating model has been. And the coronavirus situation has affected people in so many different ways, and some more brutally than others. So that kind of is opening up, and definitely within organisations there's some people for whom it's a slighter kind of impact, and for others who, you know, life-changing kind of stuff with sickness either for themselves or for loved ones. And that made me kind of go back to some experience around organisational change, a bit like Ellen was saying earlier, around loss, but also this survivor syndrome, and how to help the people who feel like they've got off kind of scot-free or got off lightly, and maybe about the place of ritual and how to mark these kind of things and what kind of habits we can introduce there. So something around that. And definitely going to, again, to what Ellen was saying, finding that this thing around emergent strategy sort of rubbing up against the deliberate strategy, both seem to be in play at the same time. And that's difficult anyway. It's really difficult now when there are so many uncertainties as well. So some really interesting things I think coming through about that. And then sort of connected to that around just some thoughts around organisational learning. And are we taking the opportunity for some really deep thinking and reflection and what that might look like?
Thank you so much. I can't wait. So let's get started in that case and come back to Ellen. And Ellen, would you like to kind of take us into a bit of depth around those three areas that you introduced a few minutes ago?
Yeah, sure. So I started thinking about emergence and more kind of dynamic ways of working. It certainly feels like, you know, we're in that place of unknown unknowns, and so analysis is out and taking action is definitely in, I think. Although what I'm observing is, quite rightly, some organisations or individuals really do feel the need to just stop and pause before they do anything. And I think we definitely need to kind of recognise that everyone's in a different place with that. So we might be thinking about what next, but might not feel ready yet to actually do anything, or be really clear about what the options are. And I think what I've noticed is some of the smaller organisations I work with have naturally had a bit more flex in them, and I think have felt a bit more able to continue the momentum. And some of the larger organisations, although that's not always the case, have taken a different approach. I think having a bias toward action now is helpful, I think, rather than sitting still, although I know that will be right for some people. And I think that's because I think if we want to try and understand the new needs of our communities and our audiences, we kind of need to do stuff with them. You know, we need to start trying things out and experimenting with them. Of course, we can do that in dialogue and ask them, but I think we're sometimes not always that clear ourselves how we're feeling. And I think certainly there's a lot of new emotional needs that we need to understand better before we start necessarily developing new offers. And I was thinking about, you know, the purpose of experiments and the purpose of, you know, prototypes and mini pilots. And I think, Anna, we mentioned this in our chat just before. I think the couple of points I would mention here is, and what keep coming up, is just being really clear about what are we trying to test here, really? Like, do we know what we're trying to test? And I think relevance is probably the most important metric at the moment. You know, how can we test what we're doing is relevant and landing well? Is it really responding to these new needs? And how big or small does our experiment need to be to help us with that? It doesn't have to be a complete digital version of this previous program, or even a pilot. It can literally just be a very small exchange or experience, I think, to help us with a bit of insight there. And I think one example of that that's emerged over the last couple of days is I work on a program called Real Creative Futures, which is actually a creative enterprise program with the New Art Exchange in Nottingham, and we deliver coaching and training to creative entrepreneurs in Nottingham. And I think our initial kind of knee-jerk reaction almost was to just take everything digital. You know, we have training programs and we have coaching and mentoring, and it wouldn't have been too difficult to do that. And I think I really applaud David Mather, the program manager, who just pressed pause for a couple of weeks just to give us time to sense check, really. I think, and just to tap into our intuition and think, is this really what our clients need right now? Do they really need training right now? Or actually, do they need something else? And I think the sense with that, they don't need that right now. It'll be useful later, I'm sure. The sense, and I use the word sense because it wasn't tested really, but the sense was people still want to connect, and they also want to be visible, and they also want to know how they can contribute. You know, they want to share what they're learning, and very much like this actually. So the tests we're making over the next few weeks are just to go back to the community and the participants, give them an opportunity to do some sessions like this, or to just to create some content or to share or just to lead the programme, certainly for the next few weeks, because that just feels like the right thing to do. We don't really know what it's going to look like yet. I think that's okay. And I think the important thing is that, you know, we've got a few individuals that we have very close relationships with who we can sound out as we go. And it's really a day-by-day process trying to work out how that programme could evolve. And I think those organisations that already have really deep and meaningful and regular dialogue with their communities have been able to pivot much more quickly, I think, because they've had that insight and they've had that connection with their community. So I think in terms of being more emergent, it is about action rather than analysis, but it's also about being really clear about what we're testing and what we're trying to find out. And I think for a couple of the larger organisations, it's thrown up some really interesting questions about leadership and what that means around leadership, because we need to make quick decisions sometimes, and we need to be able to pull in information from some unusual places perhaps. And I think while the work around stabilisation absolutely should still be a central leadership thing, I think this crisis and the situation does offer us an opportunity to try out some more distributed leadership and look at a bit more autonomy perhaps in different parts of the organisation, and just think about lines of authority in a slightly different way, so that we can be more responsive, and that if somebody has an idea, they can put it into play, still with some, you know, some guidelines and some like kind of clear sense of how we make decisions and how we evaluate. But I think from a leadership perspective, it throws up some great opportunities, I think, for working in a more just distributed way, which I know people have been thinking about, but they just haven't moved on it. So I think that's probably all I'll say about the emergent side of things, because I know Anna is going to say a bit more about that too. Shall I continue?
Yeah, do.
And I think the second thing that has really, I'm looking at my notes that are on the wall here. Second thing that I've been thinking about is that this crisis has really shone a spotlight on a number of things. I think it's really helped us to understand things in a different way, which is always really powerful, I think. I think it's helped to shake away some of that kind of dominant logic that we carry around with us, which some of it serves us really well, and some of it probably was time that we got rid of it. So I think it's really shone a spotlight on the fragility of some things. I think certainly shone a spotlight on the fragility of our wider systems, which is a bigger conversation. But I think organisationally it's done that too, as well as highlight what is really essential about what we do. And helped us make decisions about what deserves to be saved and needs to be strengthened as we redeploy resources and redeploy energy and assets and that kind of thing. And I think it's kind of given some organisations a real renewed sense of courage to do things that they've perhaps wanted to do for a while, but for one reason or another, probably being super busy, just haven't done. And that's quite exciting, actually. I think it's affording people the opportunity to be really bold in their decision making and to be quite radical, which might have been more difficult to do in another scenario, but it feels right for now. And one or two of the companies I'm working with have kind of brought forward ideas that were quite aspirational and perhaps in the 2-3 year horizon, but now they feel really important. So they've made the right step, I think, in bringing them into the foreground and focusing on some ideas that aren't ready yet. You know, they're not researched yet, but the time feels right, so they're going to run with them anyway. And I think that's really exciting. And I think the other aspect to that, which is another part of the innovation jigsaw, I think, is looking at our assets in a different way and revisiting what we have in terms of resources, and particularly our intangible assets. So we don't have access to our buildings or some of the stuff that was more important before. I think this is a great chance to look at you know, our back catalogues, and even those projects that were about to be funded and might have been shelved for now, there's still so much richness in there that we can think about how we use in a different way. And I think relationships are really critical in that too. So, you know, mapping the relationships that we have with our artists and our communities and the people that we work with, and definitely seeing those as critical assets at the moment. And what I would normally do is probably map those out in quite a kind of logical way, and use tools with like clear headings and that kind of thing. But I'm finding what's more useful at the moment is to be much more intuitive and create much more messy maps of things, probably be a lot more granular than I might normally be, and that's really helping to throw up some kind of new connections, or to look at what we have at our disposal in a slightly different way. So messy maps have been quite useful over the last week or so. Yeah, it's actually felt quite liberating, and you know, I've had clients asking me for tools and models, and we've used those, but it's also felt like a great time to just kind of dismantle the model and just go with our intuition. And actually, we haven't necessarily got time to do things in the way we might have done before. But it doesn't mean it's not proper, or it's not useful, or it's still not going to, you know, throw out some really useful stuff. Yeah, there's something around that kind of spotlight amplification and helping us rediscover things, which feels exciting. But the third thing that's felt very tangible, I think, on a personal level, and certainly talking with colleagues and clients, is that all of this is happening against the backdrop of real loss and grief and trauma, and I think it's really essential that we acknowledge that while we're also trying to think about the new and the next, and how we move through this very fast changing scenario. And that's it. I've kind of got half-baked ideas about this, and I think what some of the other panel will say will make a bit more meaning out of this. But there's maybe two things I'll share around it. So I put a question out on the Twitter sphere a couple of weeks ago because I was thinking about this, and I was struggling a bit to put my thoughts together. And so I asked a question about you know, how do we work with organisational loss, and how do we invite other people to experience that with us, and how might we use ritual and so on to move on. And I received some great responses, so I'll pull that together and maybe add it to a tag after this. But Natasha Steer responded in a really helpful way and really helped me think about this differently. And she was talking about the need to continue bonds rather than moving on. You know, this doesn't need to be about moving on. It's about continuing bonds, or taking what's useful and carrying it through, which I think might pick up on what some of the other panelists talk about in a moment. I found that really helpful because it just gave a slightly different meaning to the process. I've been thinking about how to hold those two things, the kind of loss and the new, and actually continuing bonds, particularly continuing communications and relationship with communities, feels really important. And I think the other thing, I'd gone back to the Kubler-Ross grief cycle, which you might be familiar with. It's a bit similar to the change cycle, the kind of 5-point cycle from denial through to acceptance. And had read an article that was in the Harvard Business Review, where David Kessler has added a 6th point to that. And if you've read that, this is quite new to me, but again, I found it really helpful. So his 6th point in that journey was about finding meaning, which again, I think we'll touch on what Michele and Anna talk about, and how we can try and make sense and take some meaning from this experience and from this grief and from this loss. So it's kind of beyond acceptance and into something that's that we can carry forward with us. And I found that a helpful start point to start thinking about loss and how we can have those two conversations at the same time.
Great. Thank you so much, Ellen. That's been really, really useful. And I feel like you've framed things and made sense of things that I think many of us have been noticing but not being able to order. So thanks ever so much for doing that. Michele, you mentioned an A to E set of thoughts that you were going to share. So perhaps you could take us back to that.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Richard. I think it's important to say that these come out of, as I mentioned, my own personal experience, and also conversations that I've been having largely around supporting individuals to make their own individual shifts in their working situations. I think there's an awful lot for organisations to learn from the things that have been emerging in those conversations. So I'll just go through them. So as I said, the first one is an A for awareness, and for me, it's always a starting point just to notice what's going on, and that noticing can in and of itself be the key from turning something into 100% catastrophe and negativity into actually having a seam of value within it. So for instance, one of the things that tends to happen in catastrophe, isn't it, is that we revert to the familiar, we revert to what we do automatically, but very often we do that without even really noticing it. And one of the things that has been coming up in conversation is that if we can notice, for instance, if you're working at home and it's not something that you're used to doing, and you notice how you prefer to work, that's such a gift. And I think the theme that runs through all of this that has been going around, kicking around in my head, is to take that realization, to take that nugget, those nuggets of awareness, and to ask the question and log them. And I mean genuinely, literally log them. So I've been talking with some people that I've been coaching and supporting about journaling and logging those things, and asking yourself the question in an ongoing, open way: how can I take that back to the office? How can I take that back to the studio? How can I take that back to the site, wherever it is? So in reverting to the familiar, I get to learn about how I work best, actually. That's what I do. And that can be painful, because that also means that I become aware of how I haven't been operating like that, how circumstances have disallowed me from doing that. So that's really rich, I think. So that question about what have I noticed that I want to take forward? And then I think an organizational response to that is when we get into that rebuilding, that discovery of the new normal, what is it as leaders that we can do to enable individuals to tell us what they've learned about the way they work best? Now, I think that's really exciting, really, really exciting. And I mean, all of these 5 points obviously dovetail together. So let's move on to the next one is a B for boundaries. Again, boundaries always so important for me personally, and for loads of the people that I'm working with. And that question that's been kicking around, which it is easy to see as being really flippant, but actually is so profound, which is, am I working from home or am I actually living at work? And so many people have discovered that the only boundary between work and home was the physical space. And once that physical boundary dissolves, how do we maintain those boundaries? Because boundaries are so important. We have to do it in other ways. We can do it if we're fortunate enough to have physical space where we live and have our own dedicated physical space. That's obviously really, really helpful, but it might have to be purely around time. It might have to be literally whether we sit facing the door or sitting away from the door, and there's only one particular physical kind of configuration that we use when we're working, how we delineate tasks, and also setting boundaries around our own personal capacity for support. So I find it really helpful to say to people, shout if you need anything. If I can't offer what you need, I will tell you. And that's so permission giving, because it means that you can ask, because the other person will say, I can't do that right now. Okay, no shame in asking. And that's a really important boundary. And those boundaries around, if you don't any longer have the boundary around leaving the building, how do you build that boundary in? So one of the things that somebody suggested to me, and I do as far as I'm able, usually really strictly, is that if an email comes in outside of what I consider to be my working hours, I don't respond to it. If it triggers a train of thought in my head that I'm only going to be able to manage by responding, then I respond, but I don't send the email until within working hours, because I don't want to be giving those signals about my availability. It's kind of really obvious stuff, but I just think that within this kind of scenario, boundaries become even more important. The C is for compassion. Compassion, it's a word, isn't it, that's thrown around quite a lot and can be a bit spongy. But I think particularly within this context of working from home, and I realise I'm talking a lot about working from home because that's a lot of what's been exercising people I've been speaking with, is this notion that suddenly there's this huge mountain of autonomy in terms of how you kind of organise yourself and your time and your work. Expectations have shifted, expectations haven't been set yet. So autonomy, I think, can be a really important part of compassion, alongside trust, fairly obviously, and safety, and how we build that in, and again how we then take that new trust and how we negotiate and nurture the safety. So trust is really about giving other people the benefit of the doubt. You don't need to prove to me. We're not going to use that piece of software that shows me exactly how long you've been in that Word document. It's about task-based management rather than hours-based management, and that's just very new for some people. And actually deeply liberating. So that also is exciting. And the safety, which is about getting in that team Zoom meeting or the support structure that you've set up, however that's working, and being able to say, is it bad of me, but I'm quite enjoying this, it's quite exciting, and knowing there's not going to be any recrimination or any judgment. I mean, the fact that there is literally no value, literally no sense, and literally no logic in judging anybody right now is deeply liberating, actually. So that's the compassion. The C could have been communication. It's compassion. And then the D is diversity. Of course it is, because it's me. And so it's diversity. And I'm aware that I feel fearful that the kind of, if you like, the harder protected characteristics bit of diversity could so easily get lost from the agenda in all this crisis and in all the rebuilding. It could so easily get lost. And I'm working really hard as far as within my influence to ensure that disability specifically doesn't fall off people's agendas. But at the same time, to recognise that some of what's gone on over the last 3 or 4 weeks has been so agile and so innovative and so flexible, that is really exciting in terms of being able to say to our own organisations and to other organisations, look at what we did. You know, all of that stuff that disabled people have been asking you to do for the last 35 years that you've said has been too difficult and too costly and we haven't got the software for, that you've actually now been able to make happen. Can we keep doing it? But I also mean diversity in the softer sense, you know, and a classic one at the moment is I guess introversion, extroversion, you know, and recognizing that there are some of us introverts are kind of going, yeah, now you get what it's like not to have structures set up for you. Do you know, because lots of people who have a preference for extroversion are struggling right now. Whereas those of us with a preference for introversion are going, yeah, this is hard. It's really hard. There's a lot of really terrible things happening. And this bit of it is okay. So the softer bit of diversity, and that comes back to what I was saying about awareness, about recognizing how we each work at our best and finding a way of bringing that back into an office or a studio or a rehearsal room or a workshop or backstage and still making that happen. I think it's just really exciting. And I think that's going to be absolutely fascinating. There's a kind of, I think, within diversity, there's a celebration that we can do. Look at what we managed to do. Look at it. Look at what we did. That's brilliant. And then that takes us to the E, which is experience, which for me is about it's like that thing in your personal life when sometimes you have those moments, don't you? Sometimes I have those moments where I'm aware that I'm living through the building of a memory. Something is just so gorgeous or so unusual or so meaningful that I'm aware that I'm going to remember it. And in a way, that this for me is about this period of time. I'm building experience for next month or next year. And I think as organizations, how are we contributing to our bank of learning and experience? How are we logging, documenting, flagging, celebrating the learning that we're doing and making sure that it doesn't get lost, so that when we go back into the building, all those are old ways of doing things. I guess we're talking about culture. And I know, Richard, you talk about cultural artifacts, and our cultural artifacts over the last few weeks have just gone. And they are so, you know, my cultural artifact now is the kind of vase of flowers on the dining room table that's looking at me. It's like, so how do we check which cultural artifacts we want to bring back into the building, I guess? Yeah, so I just keep coming back to, I think it's exciting, as well as everything else. I think it's exciting.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm having such a good time in this conversation. It's absolutely brilliant. So thank you so much for lighting that journey through the early stages of the alphabet and feeling more aware. I'm not sure about my boundaries. That's always a difficult one for me. But I'm certainly kind of seeing awareness, and I love that idea of noticing that we're living through the making of memories and the sort of the moments when our experiences get built. Feels really, really powerful. Thank you. Alex, would you like to take this baton and first of all, take us through your personal journey and your journey as an artist, and help us feel better as well.
I don't know if I could do that. Michelle, Ellen, thank you so much. This is well, if you're also look, if you're experiencing illness, or if you or a member of your family, extended family, if you're fearful for a loved one or someone who you work with, or for This is a really hard time. There's never been a more appropriate time to be feeling these emotions, and emotions I'll come on to. I mentioned earlier that I'm very happily 2 months tomorrow, become a father for the first time, and which many of you will probably know is the most amazing thing in the world and the most normal thing in the world. And there's a lot, I feel a number of parallels to what many of us are experiencing. The world has closed in very much. My brain feels like mince. The simplest tasks are taking the longest time. And I think this sense of complete change and a sense of ordinariness, the mundanity of waking up and wondering what day it is, or every 3 hours, and just what we do with this. What do we do with this? I think I wanted to say, as an artist, I've dedicated my career to gathering audiences together. As a public artist, directing festivals, and quite suddenly, my North Star has been taken away. We cannot gather any longer. I imagine you have a number of people within your organisation or the creative practitioners that you work with who are in a similar position, and I've been personally struggling with this quite closely because our voices and this kind of voices is so important at this moment. We need to keep our leaders. We need to speak truth to power. We need to be calling our leaders to account. We need to be bearing witness. We need to be amplifying the voices of our communities and people who don't have it. We need to be doing all of the things that power our vision as artists, or power our creative vision as creative and cultural organizations. It has never been more important for us to be doing that. So I would ask, as a kind of throwing the provocation back, is like, how can you support your creative community who already are feeling adrift to continue in the smallest ways to continue their drive to channel all of these emotions that are all struggling so much with. The shift in identity that you get from going as an individual to a parent, from going as a CEO of an organization who suddenly that mission that you've put 150% behind is thrown out the window, and you're struggling to see how to keep your staff employed. Comes back to, so noticing these emotions, making space within your home, within your head, to be understanding of your worry, and then finding the very smallest tools to support the creatives within your organization or beyond to keep doing what they're doing. I said before that I'd end with a kind of a tool which I've personally found very helpful. I don't know about you, but not only sleepless, but then also finding it very difficult to wrap my head around the magnitude of the challenges that we're all facing currently. And this is a very simple way to try and put the day to bed at night when you go to sleep. I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. Oh, desktop one. No, I can't do that.
Yeah.
Can you see my screen? Very good.
We can. Thank you.
Divide your page into 3. List all the things that are all the things that are giving you anxiety on the left. Could be a job, could be pain that you're experiencing, could be the situation, whether that's politics or beyond. List the things that you're grateful for from the day, could be as small as they are. You write what you need to do, the smallest thing that you need to do tomorrow. Could be that you check your overdraft. You write which of those are essential, which of them are desirable, and then you just don't look at it until the morning. Simple piece of paper. That's all I've got.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex. So could you just say a bit more to me about your experience as an artist and a creative practitioner at the moment, and what questions it's making you ask, and what thoughts have started to emerge about a creative response to this moment for you personally?
Yes, I'm a social artist. I work with communities. I'm really passionate about the power of art to make change. I'm a leader and we're all leaders. Where do you lead? Whom are you leading? How can we express leadership? And that is really, when struggling to put order, especially with an infant, when you're on like where do you where can we find the emotional how we are creating the emotional resources within ourselves to express creative leadership. My work, the other part to that is trying to make the extraordinary out of the ordinary, which all the stuff that we've been writing in arts council applications for so many years, we no longer have access to all of the assets. We can't go can't get on a plane, we can't, we've got a teacup, and we have, if you're lucky to have a garden, then you have that. How can we kind of laser focus the creativity to work with the smallest object and still create those interventions? That's the second bit. And then the third bit, the challenge, I've been personally, my practice is about urbanism, helping people feel more welcome in cities, and trying to make cities more safer places for kids normally to express themselves. If there's a fight is how do we turn our practices towards the real thing at hand, which is how do we support our most vulnerable communities in this time of crisis, and make sure that they have the recognition and the value that they deserve from our leaders. How can we make sure that these resources that are being diverted are diverted forever? That, this is sort of my rage and my anger as an artist, to try and push these issues, to keep them at the top of the agenda, and then feeling completely powerless to do so with a questionable internet connection and not being able to leave the house. I think this is something that a lot of creative practitioners are struggling with, and people within organizations. How do you lead your organization in this time of crisis to keep doing what it needs to do to bear witness and to play its part in society? And I don't have any answers to that. Like the responses you've seen, there are traditional avenues for responses. The state of Ohio creating an incredible advert to encourage social distancing, where you watch it, you're like, wow, this is really artistically brilliant. Oh, we can do this too. Yeah, so that's it's hard to know where to pour your energy.
Yeah, I can really see that. I can really see that your sense of what your role is as an artist in society, and what's needed from those who are empowered is still really clear, but your personal agency and your access to publics is really, really hampered at the moment, isn't it? I can feel the sense of confinement that you're... And that
and I imagine this is being shared by anyone in a position of authority, and keen to further a mission, an organizational, creative mission, personal mission. Yeah. And how do we contain these emotions and be a conduit for these emotions, so that we can keep ourselves healthy and the people that we care about in the wider sense, so our stakeholders, communities, however you want to define that, which comes back to how can you as an organization support your larger creative community to keep doing that from where they are.
Beautiful. Thank you, Alex. I really appreciate that there's more frustration and questions than answers at the moment in our conversation, and that feels right, and it feels right that we're articulating those questions in order that we can all raise our awareness about them, and can start to think about a range of ways that we might be able to channel that energy creatively. I'm going to finish this afternoon's panel with you, Anna. Would you like to pick up on some of the conversations that you've heard? And I know that you were going to talk a little bit about the divergence that you're noticing, some of the ways that you've been feeling overwhelmed, but also the kind of ways in which organisations might be responding and strategizing and learning.
Just responding to Alex, I mean, that I have about 1 billion questions going on in my head. I think, and And I was asking myself, like, which directions are my questions facing even? Are they to me? Are they to someone else? You know, maybe that's like my first step of working out is like, who am I asking all these questions to? Where am I expecting the answers to kind of come from? But definitely feeling just questions everywhere. And I don't think I feel I'm alone in that at all. But yeah, if I'm allowed, Richard, I will sort of pick up on other things that have been said as well as they go along. But this sense of divergence, it's come through listening to you all today, and I've really felt it in looking at the organisations that I've been working with, and speaking to them and about how their teams are coping and responding to the situation, and really noticing that there are real differences. It's like we all started at the starting blocks at more or less the same kind of moment. I know some people had an earlier hit and were self-isolating ahead of other people, but the lockdown moment, I suppose, came for a lot of people at the same sort of time. And so at the beginning we were like in a, you know, a bit like the Grand National or whatever, all under starters orders sort of at the same kind of time. And what I'm seeing now is much more divergence as people have taken stock of what they've got, what they could do, what they need to do for their own staff, what their own personal circumstances are, and there are differences emerging in that. And I suppose I just was going back to my previous, you know, experience doing sort of change management, particularly like at Arts Council England, working on some of those change programs, and also where we, you know, the period I was there, we used to have like we used to joke it's, you know, on a 3-year cycle we'll have a major restructure and, you know, this kind of thing. There's something really specific around the distinction that opens up for people that have experienced loss and grief, and those that feel lucky to have survived. And I think, you know, I was just reflecting on what a challenge that is for us as managers and people and consultants, people who want to help, because you're often dealing with those things in the same space, in one conversation, awareness of it. Michele was talking about compassion, and I think the compassion that is not just leaders, but your middle managers is just, you know, requires enormous compassion and empathy to hold these different experiences and viewpoints in one sort of, in one frame and be able to respond to those. You know, at an organizational level, I'm seeing, you know, a couple of people have sort of said, well, actually, we're relatively okay through this because of X, Y, and Z, but it's just the nature of their operating model. And they're finding ways, and it's become an opportunity. And there's, I think, a couple of people have sort of said, oh, this golden opportunity to address something that's been sitting there as a sort of niggle or a desire for ages, and that's really exciting. In my own backyard, the local arts centre just had to close last week, and it's a really highly valued resource, and lots of people are sort of agitated towards it, but it comes off the back of several years of cuts to the local authority, that kind of stuff. And that's, you know, that's tremendously hard. So this is all going on in the same kind of space. So when I think about that survivor syndrome, I sort of think, you know, the importance of communication, definitely, to sustain that over the time. I know that lots of people put in place loads of Zoom meetings and all that. Well, we're now into the bit where we have to pace ourselves over the distance and breaking it up into the rhythms of, like, are we into the second phase now, and what's the right kind of time frame for that, and managing that is definitely part of it. I think there's someone else, I think Ellen was talking about ritual, and I think whatever it looks like for you, for your organisation, those tiny little rituals to mark, I don't know, whether it's someone's birthday or the act of letting go of something, or yeah, I mean, even sort of like when you recognise that there's something that you all used to do and it's complete rubbish and you shouldn't do it anymore. It's like, you know, let's kind of make ourselves a picture of a bin and be putting it in it and mark it as a moment and a sort of thing. I think we're all creative. Everyone comes up with their ways of marking it, but I think finding new rituals that we can share together to help get through this and to mark what people's personal journeys and experiences are, I think that's really important. I came across this great expression, which I think is really useful, which is to move at the speed of trust. And that really landed with me because, so we kind of, it felt like we had the shock moment and then went into lots of action. What can we put out there? I've seen loads of people producing lots of new product, or taking an old product and repurposing it, or changing their building use. You know, Venue Cymru turning into a hospital, or Bristol Vic's department sewing gear, you know, which is amazing, but in this sort of action orientation. And I was really thinking about this idea about trust. Moving at the speed of trust seems to be a really good gauge for how fast you can go in your particular organisation, and taking account of all those different needs. And I really like that. So the other thing I want to talk about was I'm noticing this kind of rubbing together of the emergent and deliberate sort of strategy. So obviously, like Ellen said, lots of people sort of now turning to the 3 month hence kind of time frame, or 6 months, or the year, you know, even depending on what's right for them, and trying on one hand to have this strategy in place that will see them through the next investment round, whether that's to Arts Council England or Arts Council Wales. So it needs to be big picture enough, and the expectations are that there's still this top level, very deliberate strategy that's based on good analysis, your past performance, all of that kind of stuff. It made me laugh when Ellen said analysis is out, because I love analysis. I was like, this really hurts not doing this, right? But it's really true. And what we're trying to do is build strategy as we go along and learn from what we're going along. And something Michele said about noticing really made me think, well, we should, like, our ears and our eyes and all our faculties should almost be hurting because we're paying so much attention to what is going on. And I definitely think that about all this new product stuff. I think Ellen touched on this as well. Is like, what is it we're trying to learn from this? Definitely starting small and making those mistakes, or learning what you can, or gathering what you can, I think is really, really important. But I think, yeah, sometimes we go into it without like a clear data plan, or what's the question that we're asking ourselves. So definitely something around that. The other thing, I've been doing some scenario planning work with Magic Me, of looking at multiple futures, which isn't actually based on the worst possible scenario to the best possible scenario, but for different versions, where you to kind of take your two critical uncertainties, as they call them, and you map those in all the different combinations that they could come up. And I found that really, really helpful, almost in part as just accepting that the analysis, a bit like you say, isn't going to kind of do any good, right? You have to have your eye across all of them. But there are also common things that you can do in any scenario that will help. And one of the things I think about that exercise that sometimes we never quite get through to is, what are the early indicators of each of those scenarios, which kind of goes to that observing, noticing, thinking about what we're trying to learn. I came across a great phrase which I really loved as well, about boundary spanners and how important they are. I was like, what is about? What is that? That's kind of a tool or something. But it was really referring to people in your organisation who come into really close contact with either like suppliers, like your artists, or people that you might work with, or the audience, or the customers or beneficiaries. And that made me really pause again, because when we're closed as venues, or not offering, or not in so much direct contact, how do we maintain those boundary spanners? But yet how doubly, triply more important than they are than ever to the intelligence that we have, and to the emergent strategy building that we do. So yeah, so just maybe to be thinking about, who are those boundary spanners for you, and what are we making the most of all the fantastic information? It used to be like people at like front of house in a theatre, you know, just sit on a wealth of information about what's actually happening in an organisation and how people feel about the space. And it's that kind of equivalent, I think, is really worth thinking about. And I just that final thing around organisational learning, if we're all disposed to action, then we're also, are we thinking and stopping and thinking enough? I love the fact, Ellen's, you know, the examples of people pausing for that. And I think that seems to me to be a really special opportunity about now, actually, is that we have the opportunity for a bit of really deep thought. And it would be great to sort of take advantage of it. And perhaps it still needs to work in like little mini cycles. And perhaps structuring some of those sort of prototypes or the new product stuff in little mini cycles of like, we put it out there, we check what's happening, we ask ourselves the questions, we check we're asking the right questions, all that kind of stuff. I think it's just so important. And being on the receiving end of so much digital content, I mean, it's just like flying at you. If you want to do anything, sketching, singing, you know, whatever, you can just pick anything you like, and you could spend all year on it. So it seems that, you know, and particularly for small organisations, like how do you make your voice heard against the National or the Getty Museum or, you know, these kind of places? And I think I'd go back to the notion of like the super users, who already are the people who love and value your work, and how are they engaging with it, and what else what indications or clues can they offer you about what is really useful? I think there's this amazing tension going on possibly around like the local, global, hyperlocal, and people trusting in organisations that they know to deliver up some good content, even if it's not their own, to be signposting to really good material. Is really important. But that super user group might be the time to really think about who they are and how they're using your stuff, and to really pay attention to what they're telling you about it as well. I'm going to stop there. I've been waffling now.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. It's been absolutely amazing to spend time with you this afternoon. Thank you so much for spending, you know, for dedicating this time and your insight to help us all see the world with through slightly clearer eyes. I think I feel like we've had an experience of fatherhood during this conversation. I think we've had an experience of the constrained artist. I think we've seen the ways in which the situation is shining a light on fragility. I think we've had our awareness awakened, our compassion fueled, and many of us might be interested in moving at the speed of trust as a result of this afternoon's conversation. Thank you so much for dedicating time to this conversation in service to all the brilliant people who are out there making arts and culture, supporting communities and audiences, their lives work. And I know that that's what you're doing too. So thank you for all that you're doing, and see you again really soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard.